For Dr. Julian Devereaux, history was a thing to be cataloged, a series of facts to be curated and confined behind museum glass. The dilapidated ancestral home his family had abandoned generations ago was not a homecoming. It was a specimen. Restoring it was a calculated step towards securing a prestigious preservation grant, a key to unlocking the next tier of his academic career. He came seeking history, armed with blueprints and scholarly detachment. He did not know that in the humid, breathing darkness of the Louisiana Bayou, history is not dead. It is not even past. It is hungry. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The air didn't just feel hot, it felt heavy, a wet woolen blanket saturated with the smells of decay and frantic, unseen life. Julian killed the engine of his rental sedan, and the sudden silence was immediately devoured by a chittering, croaking, buzzing symphony. The cicada's drone was a high-tension wire of sound pulled taut over the landscape. This was the end of the line, a pock-marked gravel track that dissolved into the muddy bank of a sluggish waterway. And there it was. The Devereaux house didn't stand so much as it sagged, a tired old beast sighing into the silt. It was a two-story relic of a forgotten ambition, its once proud columns now flaking and stained green with algae. A wide porch wrapped around it, but sections had collapsed, leaving a jagged, toothless grin. The whole structure was perched on a raised foundation of brick pillars, a necessary defense against the bayou's fickle moods. But even that seemed to be failing. The house listed to one side as if the very earth were trying to swallow it. Dark water, the color of strong tea, lapped at the base of the nearest pillars. Julian stepped out of the air-conditioned car, and the humidity hit him like a physical blow, instantly beating sweat on his forehead. He tugged at the collar of his polo shirt, his meticulous urban attire already feeling absurdly out of place. His research had prepared him for the architectural decay, the water damage, the structural instability. It had not prepared him for the sheer, oppressive presence of the place. It felt watchful. His gaze was drawn past the house to the entity that dominated the property. Looming from the swamp just beyond the back of the house was a cypress tree of impossible size. It was ancient. A Goliath draped in ghostly shawls of Spanish moss. Its base was a gnarled, buttressed fortress of wood, and its massive roots, thick as a man's torso, spread like petrified tentacles. Some of them plunged deep into the brackish water, while others snaked across the yard, disappearing beneath the house itself, tangled inextricably with its foundations. It looked less like a tree growing near the house and more like an anchor holding it to this world, or perhaps dragging it down into another. "You a Devereaux?" The voice, low and gravelly, came from the water. Julian startled, turning to see a small, flat-bottomed skiff gliding silently toward a rickety dock near his car. A woman stood at the tiller, her face a mask of deep-set lines tanned by a lifetime under the Louisiana sun. She wore waders and a faded fishing cap, and her eyes, dark and sharp, missed nothing. Yes, Julian Devereaux. I'm the owner." It felt strange to say. She cut her engine, and the boat drifted to a stop. She didn't offer her name. "Heard one was coming back. First in a long time." She stared at the house, her expression unreadable, but tinged with something that looked like pity. "That house has a long memory. Best not to stir the silt." Julian offered a tight, academic smile. "I'm a historical researcher. Stirring things up is sort of the job description." She gave a short, humorless puff of air. "Some things ain't meant for descriptions. They meant to be left alone. Without another word, she used a pole to push her skiff away from the bank, her back to him as she disappeared around a bend, leaving Julian alone with the thrumming silence and her cryptic warning. A superstitious local, he concluded, a common feature in these isolated communities. He dismissed her and turned his attention back to the task at hand. The front door groaned open under his shoulder, complaining with the screech of rusted hinges. The air inside was even stiffer, thick with the scent of mildew, rot, and something else, something deeper. It was an earthy, cloyingly sweet smell, like rich soil and overripe fruit. It seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves. Dust motes danced like fairies in the slanted beams of light that pierced the grime-caked windows. The grand foyer was a wreck. A chandelier, draped in cobwebs, hung precariously. Water stains bloomed like dark continents across the ceiling and ran down the walls, peeling back layers of wallpaper like sunburnt skin. In the adjacent parlor, a grand piano listed to one side, its keys yellowed and silent, a layer of fine dark silt covering its surface. As he moved through the downstairs, documenting the damage with his phone, he began to notice the anomalies, things that his meticulous study of the original 1840s blueprints hadn't shown him. Carved into the wooden lintel above the dining room doorway was a strange spiral symbol, intricate and organic, resembling a fiddlehead fern or a coiled root. He found another, fainter one on a newel post of the grand staircase. They weren't part of any standard architectural tradition he knew. Then he found the wall. According to the blueprints, the ground floor should have had a small study tucked behind the staircase. Instead, there was a solid, plaster and lath wall, seamless with the rest of the hallway, but the wood of the floor changed subtly in front of it, the planks newer, the nails different. A room had been deliberately, carefully sealed off. He pressed his ear against the plaster, hearing nothing but the frantic beat of his own heart and the ever-present hum of the bayou outside. But he could feel a faint vibration, or perhaps he imagined it, a low thrum that seemed to resonate deep within the house's bones. And that smell, that sweet, loamy odor of decay, was strongest here. It seeped from the base of the wall, a foul breath from a sealed tomb. Julian stepped back, a flicker of unease finally penetrating his academic armor. This wasn't just neglect. This was a house with secrets, a place where history had been actively hidden, plastered over, and left to fester in the dark. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, painting the swamp in shades of bruised purple and orange, the symphony of the cicadas deepened, and Julian felt a profound, unnerving sense of isolation. He was a trespasser here, and the house, the bayou, and the ancient cypress tree were all watching him. The first few days were a battle of pragmatism against entropy. Julian established a base camp in the least damaged room, the old kitchen, running a generator for a work lamp and a hot plate. His days were spent in a sweaty, grimy routine, prying off rotten trim, testing the stability of floor joists, and creating a comprehensive restoration plan. The project was his shield, a structure of tasks and objectives that kept the house's oppressive atmosphere at bay. But the house pushed back in subtle ways. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in a room he'd just cleared. Doors he'd propped open would be inexplicably closed. He blamed the house's tilt, the humidity, his own fatigue. The sweet, earthy smell remained, a constant olfactory backdrop. Sometimes it was faint, a mere suggestion on the air. Other times it would roll through the house in a thick, cloying wave, making his eyes water. It always seemed to be strongest when he worked near the sealed-off study. His primary concern was the foundation. The list of the house was worsening, and he suspected the brick pillars on the north side, the side closest to the giant cypress, were compromised. To get a clear view, he needed to pull up the floorboards in the main hallway. He chose a spot where the wood was already soft and buckled with water damage, near the mysterious seamless wall. He wedged the crowbar into a seam and pushed. The rotten wood splintered with a wet, pulpy sound. Beneath it was a dark space of packed earth and creeping roots. But as he pulled up a larger section of the floor, the crowbar hit something solid with a dull thunk. It wasn't a joist or a brick. Curious, he cleared away the debris and grime. He found a false bottom, a cleverly concealed plank that lifted to reveal a hollowed-out compartment lined with what looks like oilcloth to ward off the damp. And inside, nestled together like sleeping serpents, were the journals. There were 5 of them, bound in dark, cracked leather, their surfaces slick with the faint condensation of the underfloor. He lifted one out. It was heavy, the pages swollen with moisture. The ink on the cover was too faded to read, but as he carefully opened it, the familiar sense of the house, that sweet, loamy decay, rose from the pages like a sigh. The handwriting within was an elegant looping script from another century. That night, under the stark, humming glare of his work lamp, with a cacophony of the bayou pressing in from all sides, Julian began to read. He chose the oldest-looking volume, its pages the color of weak tea. October 12th, 1842. We have arrived. The journey from New Orleans was arduous, but the land grants us our reward. The air is thick with life, and the water provides an abundance. I have chosen the site for the house, on a rise overlooking the water, with the blessing of the great cypress that stands sentinel. It is a being of immense age and power. The locals, a timid folk, speak of it in hushed tones, but I see not a thing to fear, but a spirit to be honored. It is the heart of this bayou. Julian paused, a slight, condescending smile on his lips. His ancestor, Julian Devereaux, was clearly a man of his time, prone to romanticizing the noble savage landscape. He read on. November 3rd, 1842. The house frame is raised. The work is hard, but the men are hale. I have begun a tradition as a sign of respect to the spirit of this place, which I have come to call Mama Cypress. After a successful hunt, I leave a portion of the kill, the heart or the liver, at the base of her trunk. When I return, it is always gone, and in its place I find the water near our dock teeming with fish or a patch of curative herbs I had not seen before. It is a dialogue, a pact of mutual respect. The journal chronicled the house's construction and the family's early years. Jean-Luc's entries were filled with a sense of reverence and wonder. He detailed rituals, burning bundles of sage and willow bark, leaving offerings of harvested honey, whispering words of thanks into the moss-draped branches. In return, Mama Cypress provided. A blight on a neighbor's property did not touch theirs. A summer squall that flattened a nearby settlement barely rustled their roof. The family thrived, healthy and prosperous, under the benevolent watch of the bayou spirit. As Julian became engrossed in the narrative, a new sound began to weave itself into the nightly chorus. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as the sigh of the wind or the skittering of rats, but it was rhythmic, persistent, a soft, dry, rustling sound. Shh, shh. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. It sounded like dry leaves skittering across a wooden floor. Julian stood up, walking to the wall that separated the kitchen from the main hall. He pressed his ear to the cool plaster. The sound was clearer here. Shh, shh. It was the whisper of 1,000 brittle things moving in the dark spaces he couldn't see. He told himself it was insects. Termites, maybe, though it didn't sound like any infestation he'd ever heard of. He returned to the journal, his focus slightly fractured, the sound a constant, unnerving presence at the edge of his hearing. The next morning he found the first bloom. On the damp wood of the doorway leading out of the kitchen, a patch of fungus had appeared overnight. It was unlike any mold or mildew he'd ever seen. It was a pale, almost luminous white, and it didn't grow in a typical circular patch. It grew in a delicate, branching pattern, like a Lichtenberg figure or the veins on a leaf. It was strangely beautiful and deeply unsettling. As he stared at it, he realized the sweet, loamy smell was intensely concentrated around the growth. He scraped it off with a putty knife, the substance coming away with a soft, fleshy texture. That night, the whispering in the walls was louder, and as he continued to read Jean-Luc's reverent prose, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. He was a man of science, of verifiable facts, but the rational explanations were beginning to feel thin, like the peeling wallpaper all around him. He was reading a history of a pact his family had made, and as he read, he had the undeniable feeling that the other party to the agreement was stirring, awakened by the presence of a Devereaux, and was beginning to whisper its own story into the very bones of the house. The second journal belonged to Jean-Luc's son, Auguste, and its pages marked a clear and disturbing transition. Written some 30 years after the first, the elegant reverence was gone, replaced by a prose that was stark, fearful, and pragmatic. The awe had curdled into obligation. May 4th, 1875. The spring rains were heavy, and the bayou has risen. Our neighbors 2 miles south lost half their livestock to the flood and the rot flood. Our land remains dry, our animals healthy. Father would have called it a blessing from Mama Cypress. I call it a debt paid. The offering this season was a full-grown sow. Her squeals as I led her to the tree disturbed my sleep for 3 nights. But the water stopped a mere inch from the porch steps. The pact holds, but the price feels higher than it did in Father's Day. Julian read, hunched over the table, the generator humming a monotonous counterpoint to the bayou's nocturnal song. The whispering in the walls had become a constant companion, a dry, sibilant chorus that seemed to follow him from room to room. He found another fungal bloom that morning, this one on the leg of the dining room table, its pale, vein-like tendrils creeping up the wood. He scraped it away, but the image was seared into his mind. He pushed deeper into Auguste's journal. The entries grew more troubled. September 19th, 1881. Another of the goats has vanished. It was penned not 50 yards from the house, yet there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, just an empty enclosure in the morning. I found tracks in the mud leading not towards the swamp at large, but directly to the old cypress. She grows impatient. The offerings of game and harvest are no longer enough. She takes what she wants now, between the scheduled tights. The children are forbidden from playing near the water after dusk. Then came the first mention of the sickness. July 12, 1886. Cousin Elodie has been taken by the silt fever. For a week she has been rambling, her eyes unfocused, speaking of roots in her lungs and whispers from the mud. She stares at the walls for hours, claiming she can see the water rising behind the plaster. The doctor says it is swamp fever, a miasma of the mind. But it is not. I know what it is. It is the bayou's influence seeping in. It is Mama Cypress testing the boundaries of the house, of our minds. We give her blood and bone to keep the water out, but she is finding other ways in. A cold dread trickled down Julian's spine, chilling him despite the oppressive humidity. Roots in her lungs, whispers from the mud. The phrases were too close, too resonant. He hadn't slept well for days. His dreams were oppressive, claustrophobic affairs. The night before, he had dreamt he was at the bottom of the bayou, his body pinned by a weight of thick black silt. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, but he was horribly, unnaturally alive. He could feel immense roots coiling around his limbs, not to crush him, but to hold him, to absorb him. He had woken up gasping, the taste of mud and decay in his mouth. During the day, his academic focus was fracturing. He'd be measuring a window frame and in his periphery see a flicker of movement. He'd whip his head around to see nothing but peeling paint, but the after-image in his mind was of a pale, root-like tendril retracting into a crack in the wall. Twice, while looking out at the murky water from the porch, he'd seen shadows move beneath the surface. Too large, too deliberate for fish. They moved with a serpentine grace that made the hair on his arms stand up. He was tired, he told himself. The isolation, the poor diet of canned goods, the constant hum of insects. It was getting to him. He was succumbing to the power of suggestion, primed by the very folklore he was unearthing. He needed a break, some human contact that didn't involve a century-old voice of despair. He took the car and drove the bumpy track back towards the nearest semblance of a town, a straggling collection of houses and storefronts called Port Fouchon. He found what he was looking for at a bait and tackle shop that doubled as a gas station and a grocery. The woman from the skiff was there, loading a cooler into the back of a battered pickup truck. Addie, the name on her worn work shirt, read. Adeline Thibodeau. Miss Thibodeau, he asked, trying to sound casual. She turned, her expression as wary as it had been on the water. Dr. Devereaux. I have a historical question, if you don't mind, part of my research. He felt foolish, but pressed on. Have you ever heard of something called silt fever? Her face, already grim, darkened. The change was palpable. She glanced around as if the name itself was a summons. You been reading things you shouldn't, she stated, her voice low. It was in some old family papers, he said, omitting that the papers were hidden under the floor. I'm just curious about the local folklore. That ain't folklore, she corrected him sharply. Folklore's stories you tell children. That's a warning. It's what we call it when the bayou claims a mind. When someone spends too much time out near the old Devereaux place, they start hearing things the water says. They get confused, forget what's real and what's in their head, start seeing things that ain't there. She looked him dead in the eye, her gaze piercing. My grandpere used to say the pact here people made didn't just protect the house, it poisoned the ground around it. The water itself, near that cypress, it's hungry. She slammed the truck door, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. Her words echoed in his mind, stripping away his last layers of skepticism. It claims a mind. They start hearing things the water says. He was no longer just a researcher studying the historical curiosity. He was a character in the latest chapter, and he was already exhibiting all the symptoms. He drove back to the house, not with a sense of purpose, but with a gathering sense of doom, as if returning to the scene of a crime that was still in progress. The third and fourth journals were filled with a grim, monotonous desperation. They chronicled a family besieged. The entries were shorter, more frantic. Mentions of failed crops despite the offerings, of strange illnesses that baffled doctors, of a pervasive sense of being watched. The pact was failing. Or rather, the entity's demands were outstripping the family's ability to pay. It was the fifth and final journal that broke him. It was small, bound in cheap, stained buckram, and belonged to his great-grandfather, Thomas Devereaux, the last of the line to live in the house. The writing was a barely controlled scrawl, the ink sometimes blotting and spreading where a trembling hand had paused too long. It was dated 1928, the year the family abruptly abandoned the property and fled to the north. She is not satisfied. The blood of beasts is no longer enough. The whispers are constant now. They are not in the walls, they are in my head. They speak of the root, the deep root, the heart root. They promise peace if the price is paid, a true price, a price of the bloodline. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He had to force himself to continue. The next entry was a week later, the script almost illegible. Elise is gone. My sweet Elise, just 6 years old. We searched for 2 days. The sheriff said it was the swamp, a gator, a misstep in the dark. He filed the report, closed the case. He didn't see the way the moss on the great cypress hangs differently. He doesn't hear the way the whispers have quieted. He doesn't understand the peace that has settled over this house, this terrible, silent, well-fed peace. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on Julian's cheek. Elise. He remembered her name from the family tree, a tragic footnote, a child lost to the bayou. It wasn't an accident. It was a sacrifice. His great-grandfather had fed his own daughter to the thing in the swamp to buy his family's escape. The final entry was a mad, desperate scrawl written on the day they left. It has a taste for us now. The pact is remade in blood and sorrow. It will sleep for a time, sated, but the hunger will return. It is bound to our name, our lineage. We can run, but the root remains. A Devereaux must always tend the root. If the line leaves, the hunger grows. It will wait. God forgive me. God forgive us all. A Devereaux must always tend the root. The words pulsed in Julian's mind, a rhythmic condemnation. He was the first of the line to return in almost a century, the first Devereaux to come within reach of the root. The hunger had grown, and he had unwittingly announced his presence. The house, as if sensing his comprehension, shed its last vestiges of subtlety. The phenomena became aggressively physical. That night, a viscous dark silt, thick as crude oil, began to seep up through the seams of the floorboards in the hall, pooling in dark, glistening puddles that smelled of the deep swamp and the grave. The pale fungi were no longer just patches. They were growing with terrifying speed, spreading from the baseboards up the walls in complex, interconnected patterns that mimicked the cypress roots outside. The tendrils crept, inch by inch, across the peeling wallpaper, a slow-motion invasion. The house was being terraformed from within, becoming an extension of the bayou itself. At dusk, Julian stood frozen on the porch, staring at the water by the dock. He saw them clearly this time, not shadows, but forms. Pale, vaguely humanoid shapes, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid, writhed slowly beneath the black surface. They weren't swimming, they were uncoiling. He watched, mesmerized with horror, as one of the shapes resolved for a moment into a pale, upturned face with dark hollows for eyes before dissolving back into the murk. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, and nearly tripped over something on the porch steps. He looked down. It was a grackle, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Its black eyes were dull, and its beak was open in a silent scream. As he watched, a single pale tendril of the now familiar fungus snaked out from a crack between the floorboards and touched the bird's wing. The moment it made contact, the bird's feathers seemed to darken and wilt, and the fungus began to spread with unnatural speed, cocooning the small body in a white, veiny shroud. Julian didn't feel revulsion. He didn't feel pity for the bird. To his profound and soul-shattering horror, what he felt was a distant, echoing sense of satisfaction. It wasn't his own emotion. It was a psychic broadcast, a wave of calming contentment that emanated from the direction of the great cypress. A quiet, terrifying thank you. It was a test, an appetizer. The entity Mama Cypress, the cypress silt, whatever it was, knew he was there. It knew he had read the journals, and it was reminding him of the terms of the pact, expecting him to provide to begin the cycle of offerings anew. The dead bird was the first course, and Julian understood with chilling certainty that he was intended to be the main. The illusion of control was gone. The house was no longer a passive, decaying structure. It was an active participant in his torment, a cage being built around him. The next morning, he decided to flee. The grant, the research, his career, none of it mattered. He threw his few belongings into a bag, grabbed the journals, and ran for the front door. It wouldn't open. The heavy oak door, which had groaned and complained but always yielded, was now fused shut. He threw his shoulder against it again and again until his bone ached and the wood didn't even shudder. It was as if the frame itself had warped, gripping the door in a titanic hold. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He ran to the window in the parlor, the one he'd managed to pry open a few days earlier. It was slammed shut and refused to budge. The sash seemingly melted into the frame. Every window he tried was the same. The house had sealed itself. Desperate, he scrambled for his car keys. The car was his last hope. But when he tried the engine, it only produced a sick, gurgling churn. He popped the hood. The engine block, which had been perfectly fine the day before, was flooded. Not with oil or coolant, but with brackish, foul-smelling bayou water, thick with silt and algae. It was impossible. The car was parked on a rise 30 yards from the water's edge, yet here was the swamp inside the machine, disabling it with a quiet, malicious totality. He was stranded. The path back to the main road, his only way out on foot, now seemed impossibly distant. An unnatural, thick fog rolled in from the swamp, not the typical morning mist, but a dense, white wall that swallowed the landscape, reducing visibility to a few feet. It clung to the house, muffling all sound, except for the whispers. They were clearer now, no longer just the rustling of leaves. They had voices. As he stood defeated in the center of the hall, the whispers coiled in the air around him. He heard the stern, fearful voice of August from the journals. She takes what she wants now. He heard the frantic, broken sobs of his great-grandfather, Thomas. Elise, my sweet Elise, God forgive me. And worst of all, he heard his own voice, twisted with despair and self-doubt, a psychic echo of his own growing madness. It's just the isolation. You're imagining it. There's no way out. You belong here. He fled to the relative safety of the back porch, gasping for air that wasn't thick with whispers and the smell of decay. He stared into the murky water by the dock, his mind reeling. The surface was like black glass, and as he looked, his reflection wavered and dissolved. In its place, another face looked up at him. It was Julian Devereaux, his expression of one of stern disappointment. The face morphed, the features softening into the terrified visage of Auguste. Then another and another. A parade of his ancestors, their faces rising from the depths. They weren't angry, they were pleading, their silent mouths forming words he couldn't hear, their eyes filled with an eternity of shared torment. They were prisoners here too, their spirits bound to this cursed land. Then the vision shifted. The faces vanished, and he was shown a horrifying, fleeting tableau, a small white dress tangled in a cypress root, a flash of pale limbs in dark water, and the awful, profound silence that followed. He was seeing the final sacrifice. The entity wasn't just telling him the story, it was showing him the receipt for the family's freedom, a bill that was now long past due. He staggered back, retching over the side of the porch. As he wiped his mouth, he saw movement. It was Adeline Thibodeau's skiff, materializing from the fog like a ghost. She didn't come to the dock. She kept a safe distance, maybe 30 feet out on the water, her engine idling. "I knew it," she called out, her voice cutting through the fog. "That fog ain't right. The air ain't right. It has you." "The house," Julian croaked, his voice raw. "It won't let me leave. The car, everything." Addie's face was a grim mask of resignation. She had seen this before, or at least had heard the stories. "It's woken up, the hunger, and your blood, it's a dinner bell." She reached into a sack at her feet and pulled out a small, tightly wrapped bundle of herbs tied with red string and a heavy, rusted piece of iron, what looked like an old railroad spike. "This is all I can do for you," she yelled, and with a surprisingly strong arm, she tossed the items on the bank of the yard, halfway between the house and the water. "Burn the herbs in every room. It'll confuse the air, give you a moment to think straight. The iron, keep it on you. It hates iron. It's old, it's of the earth, but it's cold, dead earth. It's an insult to the life it wants." She paused, her gaze flicking towards the great cypress. "This won't save you, you hear me? It's like throwing a rock at a hurricane. It just buys you time. My people, we know to stay away. The Devereaux pact, it made this ground holy to that thing, but unholy for everyone else. You either feed it what it wants, or you find a way to starve it at the root." Before Julian could ask more, she engaged her motor and reversed her skiff, melting back into the white, suffocating fog, leaving him with a bundle of herbs, a spike of rust, and a terrifying, impossible choice. The burning herbs did clear the air, just as Addie had promised. The cloying, sweet smell of decay receded, replaced by the sharp, aromatic scent of sage and something else, something bitter and resinous. The whispers in the walls faded to a barely perceptible murmur, like a radio playing in a distant room. It was a reprieve, a fragile bubble of clarity in a sea of madness. Julian knew it wouldn't last. The house felt quiet, but it was the quiet of a predator holding its breath. He clutched the heavy railroad spike in his hand. Its cold, solid weight was a comfort, an anchor to reality. Addie's words echoed in his mind. You either feed it what it wants, or you find a way to starve it at the root. Feeding it was unthinkable. That path led to a horror his great-grandfather had already walked, a damnation of the soul. He had to starve it. But how do you starve a thing that is woven into the very ecosystem, a thing whose body was the bayou and whose heart was the ancient cypress? The answer had to be in the journals. He went back to the last one, Thomas Devereaux's desperate chronicle of sacrifice and escape. He ignored the passages of grief and fear, searching for a clue, a moment of weakness, a single mistake the entity had made. He found it in a half-mad, rambling entry written days after the disappearance of his daughter. The peace is false. I can feel its satisfaction, but there is a wound. Where I laid her to rest, near the gnarled roots, the ground itself is sore. The Spanish moss directly above has withered and turned black. The water there is still dead. It took her, but the taking left a scar. It is pure life, growth, and hunger, but a true death, a death born of sorrow and despair, is a poison to it. It can consume it, but it cannot digest it whole. It leaves a sickness in the root. A desperate, terrifying idea began to form in Julian's mind, the site of the sacrifice. It wasn't just a place of horror, it was a place of vulnerability, a wound. If he could find that exact spot, perhaps he could exploit that weakness, cauterize the connection between the entity and his family. He left the fragile sanctuary of the house, the iron spike heavy in his pocket. The fog was still thick, but he felt a pull, a psychic tug emanating from the direction of the great cypress. It was a different sensation from before, not the general oppressive presence, but a focused, nauseating beacon, drawing him toward the source of its power and its pain. He followed the pull around the side of the house, his feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. He was approaching the base of Mama Cypress. The tree was even more monstrous up close. The buttressed roots were like the ramparts of a fortress, gnarled and ancient, covered in a slick, pale fungus. And there, nestled between two of the largest roots, was a small, unnatural clearing. The ground was bare, a patch of dark, oily mud where no grass or weeds would grow. The Spanish moss hanging from the branch directly overhead was black and brittle, just as the journal described. A small flat stone, almost completely swallowed by the mud, marked the center. This was it, the place where his great-grandfather had made his unspeakable offering. The oppressive energy here was overwhelming. It was a psychic scream held in amber, a silent, eternal replay of a child's last moments of terror and a father's soul-crushing despair. The air was thick with sorrow. As Julian stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the sunken stone, he felt the entity's will for the first time, not as a whisper or a vision, but as a direct, invasive presence in his mind. There were no words. It was a pure, primal transmission of cosmic hunger, a need that had been building for nearly a century. It flowed into him, a current of raw desire, But it was more than that. It was a negotiation. It showed him visions, flashes of a future he could have, the grant, awarded with unanimous praise, his book, a bestseller, academic renown, a life of respect and success, safety. It showed him the house restored to its former glory, a proud testament to his name. It promised to protect him, to provide for him, just as it had for Jean-Luc. All it asked for was sustenance, a new offering to seal the new pact. It didn't show him what that offering would be, but it let him feel the chilling implication. There were other people in the bayou. Addie, a lost fisherman, a careless tourist. Then it showed him the alternative. It showed him the house, groaning and splintering as the roots below pulled it down into the black water. It showed him his own mind dissolving into a maelstrom of whispers and hallucinations, the final, permanent stage of the silt fever. It showed him his body, pale and bloated, becoming one of the writhing shapes beneath the water, his spirit joining the chorus of tormented ancestors. He stood on the precipice, the psychic weight of the entity pressing down on him, the cold iron of the spike in his pocket, a tiny point of defiance. The choice was clear. He couldn't run. The entity was bound to his blood, and its influence was already in his mind. He couldn't simply leave. He had to answer its demand. He could feed the hunger and become a monster, or he could try to sever the connection, to fight a god in its own church and risk being utterly destroyed. He gripped the iron spike, his knuckles white. There was no choice at all. The burning herbs did clear the air, just as Addie had promised. The cloying, sweet smell of decay receded, replaced by the sharp, aromatic scent of sage and something else, something bitter and resinous. The whispers in the walls faded to a barely perceptible murmur, like a radio playing in a distant room. It was a reprieve, a fragile bubble of clarity in a sea of madness. Julian knew it wouldn't last. The house felt quiet, but it was the quiet of a predator holding its breath. He clutched the heavy railroad spike in his hand. Its cold, solid weight was a comfort, an anchor to reality. Addie's words echoed in his mind. You either feed it what it wants, or you find a way to starve it at the root. Feeding it was unthinkable. That path led to a horror his great-grandfather had already walked, a damnation of the soul. He had to starve it. But how do you starve a thing that is woven into the very ecosystem, a thing whose body was the bayou and whose heart was the ancient cypress? The answer had to be in the journals. He went back to the last one, Thomas Devereaux's desperate chronicle of sacrifice and escape. He ignored the passages of grief and fear, searching for a clue, a moment of weakness, a single mistake the entity had made. He found it in a half-mad, rambling entry written days after the disappearance of his daughter. The peace is false. I can feel its satisfaction, but there is a wound. Where I laid her to rest, near the gnarled roots, the ground itself is sore. The Spanish moss directly above has withered and turned black. The water there is still dead. It took her, but the taking left a scar. It is pure life, growth, and hunger, but a true death, a death born of sorrow and despair, is a poison to it. It can consume it, but it cannot digest it whole. It leaves a sickness in the root. A desperate, terrifying idea began to form in Julian's mind, the site of the sacrifice. It wasn't just a place of horror, it was a place of vulnerability, a wound. If he could find that exact spot, perhaps he could exploit that weakness, cauterize the connection between the entity and his family. He left the fragile sanctuary of the house, the iron spike heavy in his pocket. The fog was still thick, but he felt a pull, a psychic tug emanating from the direction of the great cypress. It was a different sensation from before, not the general oppressive presence, but a focused, nauseating beacon, drawing him toward the source of its power and its pain. He followed the pull around the side of the house, his feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. He was approaching the base of Mama Cypress. The tree was even more monstrous up close. The buttressed roots were like the ramparts of a fortress, gnarled and ancient, covered in a slick, pale fungus. And there, nestled between two of the largest roots, was a small, unnatural clearing. The ground was bare, a patch of dark, oily mud where no grass or weeds would grow. The Spanish moss hanging from the branch directly overhead was black and brittle, just as the journal described. A small flat stone, almost completely swallowed by the mud, marked the center. This was it, the place where his great-grandfather had made his unspeakable offering. The oppressive energy here was overwhelming. It was a psychic scream held in amber, a silent, eternal replay of a child's last moments of terror and a father's soul-crushing despair. The air was thick with sorrow. As Julian stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the sunken stone, he felt the entity's will for the first time, not as a whisper or a vision, but as a direct, invasive presence in his mind. There were no words. It was a pure, primal transmission of cosmic hunger, a need that had been building for nearly a century. It flowed into him, a current of raw desire. But it was more than that. It was a negotiation. It showed him visions, flashes of a future he could have, the grant, awarded with unanimous praise, his book, a bestseller, academic renown, a life of respect and success, safety. It showed him the house restored to its former glory, a proud testament to his name. It promised to protect him, to provide for him, just as it had for Jean-Luc. All it asked for was sustenance, a new offering to seal the new pact. It didn't show him what that offering would be, but it let him feel the chilling implication. There were other people in the bayou. Addie, a lost fisherman, a careless tourist. Then it showed him the alternative. It showed him the house, groaning and splintering as the roots below pulled it down into the black water. It showed him his own mind dissolving into a maelstrom of whispers and hallucinations, the final, permanent stage of the silt fever. It showed him his body, pale and bloated, becoming one of the writhing shapes beneath the water, his spirit joining the chorus of tormented ancestors. He stood on the precipice, the psychic weight of the entity pressing down on him, the cold iron of the spike in his pocket, a tiny point of defiance. The choice was clear. He couldn't run. The entity was bound to his blood, and its influence was already in his mind. He couldn't simply leave. He had to answer its demand. He could feed the hunger and become a monster, or he could try to sever the connection, to fight a god in its own church and risk being utterly destroyed. He gripped the iron spike, his knuckles white. There was no choice at all.
The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. By dawn, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray. Julian awoke on the floor of the kitchen, though he had no memory of getting there. His body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and his mind felt scoured, raw, and blessedly, terrifyingly silent. He pushed himself to his feet and walked through the house. The change was absolute. The oppressive wake in the air was gone. The cloying, sweet smell of decay had been replaced by the simple, clean scent of damp wood and rain. The pale, veiny fungus that had crept up the walls had crumbled into a fine, inert gray powder on the floor. He went to the front door, the one that had been fused shut. With a simple turn of the knob, it swung open with a slight, natural creak. The house was just a house again, a decaying, water-damaged, empty shell. Outside the bayou was just a bayou. The water was murky, the insects hummed, but the watchful intelligence was gone. The landscape was no longer a conscious entity observing him.
He looked at the great cypress tree. It still stood, a giant of the swamp, but it looked diminished. A deep black scar marred the root where he had driven the spike, and the branches above seemed to droop with a sickness that was more than just physical damage. The entity was gone from the house, gone from his mind, but it was still there, in the tree, wounded and withdrawn. He knew he couldn't stay. The grant, the restoration, the academic paper, they were artifacts from a different life, belonging to a man who no longer existed. That man had believed history could be neatly cataloged. Julian now knew that some history is a living infection, and you don't restore its vessel, you quarantine it. He packed his bags, leaving the generator and his tools behind. He found the journals sitting on the kitchen table, and for a moment considered burning them. But he couldn't. They were a testament, a warning. He took them with him. Before he left, he made one last call to the Historical Preservation Society. He informed them that due to unforeseen and catastrophic structural and environmental instability, the Devereaux house was unsalvageable. He recommended the property be condemned and cordoned off indefinitely, citing unique soil subsidence and a virulent, unidentifiable fungal blight that posed a potential biohazard. It was the best he could do, a lie to protect the truth. Months passed. Julian was back in his sterile, modern apartment in a city where the only swamps were metaphorical. He had resigned from his university position, unable to face the dispassionate academic dissection of history and folklore. He couldn't teach stories about curses and entities as if they were quaint cultural artifacts. He had lived one. He was trying to build a new life, but the bayou had left its mark, a permanent stain on his psyche. He had a profound, visceral fear of deep water, of the gnarled roots of city park trees, of the smell of damp earth after a rain. He would wake up some nights, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of silt filling his lungs. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them was a form of haunting in itself. He was free, but he was also permanently marked, like a soldier carrying the trauma of a war no one else could understand. One evening, he was watering the small collection of houseplants on his windowsill, a mundane ritual of his new quiet life. His gaze fell on a small succulent, a plant he'd owned for over a year. There, on the dark soil at its base, was a small patch of mold he hadn't noticed before. It was pale, almost luminous white. And it wasn't growing in a typical fuzzy circle. It was growing in a delicate, branching pattern, like a Lichtenberg figure, like the veins on a leaf. His breath caught in his throat. It was just mold, he told himself, a coincidence. His mind was playing tricks on him. He reached out a trembling finger and touched it. For the briefest, most infinitesimal fraction of a second, he felt it. Not a voice, not a presence, just a psychic echo, faint and distant, like a radio signal from across the universe. It was an echo of ancient, primal hunger, an echo of the oppressive, cloying humidity of the Louisiana Bayou. He recoiled as if burned, stumbling back from the window. With a frantic, guttural cry, he snatched the small ceramic pot and threw it into his kitchen trash, burying it under coffee grounds and junk mail. He stood there panting, his heart hammering in his chest, staring at the garbage can as if it contained a venomous snake. The entity was wounded, vanquished from its throne, but a thing that old, that vast, doesn't truly die. Its spores could travel. Its memory could linger. He had escaped the house, but he knew with a sudden, soul-freezing certainty that he would never be completely free of the silt. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.